questions. So whether it's your morning, afternoon, or evening, it's really my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Why Strategy Matters for Startups. And it's so appropriate that we're doing this from the heart of the MIT campus here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just outside our office, there's a plaque on the street that says this is the most innovative square mile in the world. And we truly believe that and live that here at MIT. Innovation and entrepreneurship is part of our DNA. It's what we do. It's what we're known for. And in the next hour or so, we're really hoping to share some key insights from some of our top faculty on strategy and why strategy matters for startups and in entrepreneurial ventures. If any of you have been to our programs here at MIT Sloan, you know that we're very much about action learning and engaging with you. So we do encourage you to use the chat box throughout the webinar. If you have questions or comments or observations, please be engaged, participate, and let us know what you're thinking in the chat box. We'll also have time at the end of the webinar today for questions and answers, and we hope that you'll use the chat box to submit questions that may have come up to you during the course of the program as well. So as I mentioned, MIT, Kendall Square, it's very much about innovation and entrepreneurship, and we have two really wonderful faculty here to guide us through the content and the material today and share some of their key insights. We're joined by Erin Scott. Erin's a senior lecturer in our Technological Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Strategic Management group here at MIT Sloan. As you can see from Erin's background, her PhD draws upon nearly 2 decades of academic and practical experience, looking at groundbreaking innovators, helping them successfully navigate the entrepreneurial journey from initial idea to commercialization. She teaches extensively here at MIT Sloan, and in particular, she teaches in one of our great executive education programs offerings, Strategy for Startups. We'll tell you a little bit more about that program at the end of today's webinar, and hope that after you hear today from Erin and Scott, maybe you'll join us for one of their really insightful 2-day programs to really dig deeper on this topic. As I mentioned, joining Erin, we have Scott Stern. Scott is the David Sarnoff Professor of Management here at the MIT Sloan School. He also explores how innovation and entrepreneurship differ from more traditional economic activities, considering kind of the large corporate environment, but shifting more towards entrepreneurial ventures, startups, and that entire ecosystem. And a lot of his research and his teaching here at MIT focuses on different ways that entrepreneurs and innovators can really get strategy right, and why it's a critical part of their business plan. Scott also teaches with Erin in our program here in executive education. They both teach extensively throughout the MIT Sloan community as well. I know they have a lot of information to share with you today. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Scott to get us started. Scott, to you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you to the entire executive education team. Just to be clear, as Rob already said, what we're going to cover today is why active choice and strategy matters for startups, how to balance the process of learning and experimentation with the need to make strategic commitments, and really focusing on the most critical choices that startups face and how to use what we're going to call the entrepreneurial strategy compass to sort of see how your choices fit together and navigate that entrepreneurial journey. Rob was kind enough, and the team was kind enough to give both Erin and I a nice introduction, but so we'll kind of dig right into it. So what are we going to be talking about over the next hour? Really about how are the core choices that founders face, and how can you turn the process of making those most critical choices, of choosing the path for how to develop your idea and bring it to impact, into building and scaling a successful venture. Kind of think about that. I'm going to start with a little bit of an example. So here is a student that came to MIT almost a decade ago now. This is Socrates Rosenfeld. He had been a West Point grad and had actually served in the military as an Army Ranger in Special Forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Came to MIT, took a bunch of courses with Erin and myself, as well as others throughout our ecosystem. Fantastic student, went off at the end of graduation to McKinsey. Interestingly, walked into our offices about 2 years later And he says, you know what? Right? He came actually with a group of some co-founders and some other students from Sloan. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to pursue an entrepreneurial venture. Here's my idea. We know that there is rapid legalization of cannabis for both medicinal and adult use. And we know that that industry is kind of, in some sense, a little bit left behind. It's kind of just emerging. It's almost like the end of prohibition was in the 1930s. He's going to figure out cannabis legalization meets the internet. And so I know you're kind of joining us from all around the world, but kind of what I would just kind of right. So that's kind of controversial idea. I think both Erin and I were a little shocked when he started talking about this, but we're like, okay. And he had actually kind of come out of the military, had sort of to deal with his anxiety and stress, even though he was extraordinary student and leader. He had ended up using cannabis as to kind of bring him to make himself more effective. But once you say cannabis meets the internet, it's not like you can't, all of a sudden you can think of lots of different ways that you could turn that broad idea and make it a reality. So let me just give you kind of, right? So in some sense, right, Sock and his team were kind of thinking through those early choices. They were able to think about multiple alternative paths that they could take their core idea, cannabis meets the internet, to bring that idea to market. Just kind of put a little bit of kind of context on that, right? Right, here are some, I remember doing this in our offices, right? Sock and his team were able to develop at least 4 concrete alternatives that help them think about how they could use a kind of tech-focused team to enter this new emerging and rapidly growing industry. So one was that there was a kind of challenge of going, right, so for the legal side of the emerging cannabis industry, that state level legalization, there's a big, very highly regulated. And so there were lots of challenges in what was called the seed to sale problem. Essentially, how do you go from the actual, plants that are grown to something that's in these regulated cannabis dispensaries? And they could kind of imagine a whole bunch of kind of deploying their technology and insight to that domain. Second domain they thought about was that there actually were already existing players, companies like Weed Maps, that were kind of like a Yelp for cannabis. They kind of gave you a broad map. They didn't really interact with the stores or the dispensaries too much. Instead, what the Weed Maps did is they kind of just gave you a kind of lay of the land of where you could find different vendors, and there were reviews. Interestingly, Weed Maps both allowed for the fully legal state level dispensaries, but also more gray market options to be included. Third, sometime they talked to a bunch of people, said, you should just go open. You need to be close to the customer. You need to just get started. You should go and apply for one of these licenses, and you should open a state level a dispensary. You could bring that technology in. You could bring that customer experience directly to the final customer. And then finally, they knew that there were lots of these dispensaries opening up very quickly, literally hundreds per year. Very few of them were very technologically savvy, and they could become the digital storefront, essentially build out the kind of web capability for all these emerging players in this rapidly growing marketplace. Now, we're not going to do a full case discussion right now, but just kind of maybe put in the chat. I see some people kind of coming from all around the world. Easy from Los Angeles. Maybe just put in the chat. I'll try to follow it as we go. Kind of out of all those options, are there any that you kind of think that, if you were going to go into this industry, you might think about, this is about 2015 or 16, which are ones that you might think are most attractive as a path to build out this venture? Digitization, I say. Look at this. We're seeing a bunch of others. Okay. Oh, hello. Oh, a bit on the data. Oh, inventory system. Some people go with the dispensary, some digital, right? So there's kind of a bunch of different kind of options there, right? And once again, different people are going to be, right? I see the directory, agritech, right? Not too much love here, at least in this group for the dispensary. I think I only saw one of those in the chat. But once again, even reasonable people, right? Good founders can actually disagree about the way that their venture can go. Once again, everyone, very often entrepreneurs face the challenge of, is there demand for the product? Interestingly, in the cannabis industry, that is not the main challenge. There is demand. It's already an $80 billion industry. It's how do we, right, make that a legal industry through this newly regulated context. So, right, oh my goodness, education and trading to set standards, medical cannabis, I'm loving it all. So what we're going to talk about in the next little while is how do you undertake a process of essentially not simply identifying these alternatives, but understanding the core choices you would make along each of these alternatives and how those core choices fit together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy, and how to undertake the learning and experimentation that's required to allow you to essentially kind of break through the blizzard of options that you might face to actually bring a product or service and then to market successfully and then scale your company. Right? Essentially at the core of strategy for startups is the idea that, right, we're at MIT, there's lots of great ideas around campus and we love great ideas, but the challenge of innovation-based entrepreneurship is not only about coming up with great ideas. It's about choosing how to implement those ideas in a way that creates value in the market and allows that venture to capture some value, a meaningful value on a sustainable basis. And so kind of in some sense, what strategy for startups is about the choice among alternative visions for your idea and company. Alternative paths that it's choosing among the alternative paths that your company can go down. Just to kind of give you kind of, as we were kind of preparing for this particular webinar, Erin and I were sort of thinking about, lots of the founders that we're currently working with all across campus and around the world, kind of, right, one of the big problems, right, challenges that you as a potential founder face right now is we are in, for a number of years, more venture capital was being expended than ever before. Fundraising was actually not the main barrier. All of a sudden, over the past 6 months, and even more accelerated in just the past few months, there has been a tremendous increase in the bar that needs to be reached to sort of attract the capital required to really build out and scale an entrepreneurial venture. And what we're finding is that the role of being super clear about how you, and rigorous and disciplined about how you undertook the learning and experimentation to validate your key hypotheses, and then how you take that validation to formulate and implement an overall entrepreneurial strategy is kind of really, in some sense, among the most critical elements that's really driving the scaling of the ability of companies to sort of attract capital in this more rigorous environment. How do we do that? Well, in some sense, I'm going to step one step back and kind of say, well, right now, ventures are kind of getting all right, particularly in this kind of heightened environment. Entrepreneurs are getting all sorts of advice. And kind of advice kind of comes in two basic categories. On the one hand, a lot of the advice that founders get from well-meaning advisors and mentors or even financiers, it's very action-oriented. And that's great. We love action-oriented advice. Here's Richard Branson. If you're looking to become an entrepreneur, don't waste your time going to university or business school. Just get on and do it. Right? It doesn't quite tell you the it to do, but the idea is that you already know where you want to go. Right? You already know where you want to go. We need a little bit of a kick in the pants and get going. And let me be clear, that's really important type of advice. I'm sure many of us have teenage children, occasionally just telling them, go do it. That's actually pretty darn good advice. On the other hand, this different kind of advice is when you give people a framework, essentially planning. And right, a lot of them those of you who come from more traditional management backgrounds or even traditional strategy backgrounds, the idea is that we can sort of undertake very careful cost-benefit analysis to kind of rank and sort of identify the ideal option, right? Undertake cost-benefit analysis to figure out what's the right thing to do before we have to commit to anything. But what do you do, right? What do you do when, as Sock Rosenfeld and his team faced, as most entrepreneurs face, there's lots of different options. Can see still a lot of kind of interest there in cannabis in the chat. There's lots of potential routes. You're startup, so you can't do them all. You face a lot of uncertainty, right? Entrepreneurship is more of a hypothesis to be tested, right? You're going to have to learn and experiment. And there's only so much learning you can do before you inevitably start to commit to some paths over others. Essentially, the kind of core question, or the core first question you have to face is, how do we undertake the process of learning and experimentation in a way that lets us learn enough about the alternative paths to figure out what strategy to choose? Just kind of essentially what entrepreneurial strategy is essentially tries to resolve that kind of trade-off between learning and experimentation and the necessity of commitment as you scale out your company. It's the sequence of choices you make to test specific value creation and value capture hypotheses when experimentation requires partial commitment, right? One of the kind of key tools that we talk about, one of the kind of key insights that are working with startups, as well as the work that research that we've done in this area has kind of illuminated, is that there's no one right answer in entrepreneurship. There's no one particular path that's necessarily going to be better than all the others. If you have a good idea, there are going to be multiple paths that you're going to be able to surface. Some of those paths, of course, as you undertake learning and experimentation, are probably not going to work. But you're probably going to be able to identify multiple potential paths to value, recognizing that you can't do them all. And we kind of developed a kind of way of kind of making those choices that we call test two, choose one, in which the role that you undertake in learning and experimentation is to surface alternatives. And then what you do is, once you've surfaced multiple meaningful paths, each of which could potentially succeed, that's the time when you have to actually choose one path and potentially leave other paths behind, at least for the time being. Just kind of put a little kind of content on that, right? So this is part of a very broad kind of body of work that we have, both Erin and myself, as well as our collaborator, Josh Gans, kind of 3 principles that come out of this test two, choose one idea are, first, that your choices matter. That kind of which path you choose is going to be consequential for the kind of venture you build. The second, that your choices in particular domains matter. And Erin's going to talk about that in just a little bit. Your choice of customer, technology, your team, your path to the marketplace. And then those choices also all come together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy. And Erin's going to talk about some of the work we've done in developing an entrepreneurial strategy compass that helps you navigate those concrete alternative strategic paths. As I said before, one of the kind of key elements that enables that choice process is that kind of the first step is being really clear about what kind of experiments, what kind of learning we want to undertake to prioritize, right? We could prioritize particular, right, paths to the marketplace. And I see Michael Eisworth is still working absolutely, the tobacco industry, alcohol industry, so on and so forth. So we'll come back to that in a little while. And so one of the things we do is really take a kind of choice-based approach to entrepreneurial experimentation and learning. So what does an ideal experiment look like? So in an ideal experiment, you want to test your most critical hypothesis. Very often, startups do a lot of learning, but they may not be exactly on the most critical hypothesis that says, is this idea fundamentally worth pursuing? And is this particular strategic approach that I'm exploring likely to lead to a viable business? Now, of course, we can maybe state what those most critical hypotheses are, but then we have to design experiments that can kind of give us information, allow us to learn with high fidelity, allow us to learn, right, not be with bias, but kind of do that kind of in a way that gives us a good read on the validity or not of our core hypothesis. And we want to do both of those things, highly critical experiments at right, high fidelity at relatively low opportunity cost, right? So if we kind of decide that we can, figure this all out, but it's going to cost, $20 million to figure out if it's a good idea, that may be a little bit expensive to even get started, right? Before, right, we actually understand whether or not this is a venture worth pursuing. Just over the last 2 years, actually, we had a group of fantastic students. Let me actually do this in this order. We had a group of fantastic students who built out a company called Taxi. Relatively narrow project, very cool, where what they did is they recognized, this is about 2 years ago, they recognized, I agree with you, Michael, right? We'll come back to that, right? They recognized there was this opportunity where rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft were offering kind of premium prices for Tesla vehicles, for right? If people were driving kind of clean energy, higher end vehicles. On the other hand, actually, while that was a premium for those that owned a Tesla, there was no real ability for most people who are in the gig economy to actually access those vehicles. And it was not a priority of either Uber or Lyft, nor was it a priority of Tesla to really make that happen. And so this group of students came together and they're like, that actually would solve a bunch of problems all at the same time. Be better for the drivers, better for the environment, better for the rideshare experience and the final customer. Good idea. Then what they undertook, and this was literally as they were students, they went from that as an idea to an extremely efficient way of learning if it was a good idea, a good enough idea to actually pursue as a meaningful venture. They actually bought a Tesla and went through all the kind of legal hassle of figuring out how to get it insured and so on and so forth for this purpose. And while they were in school, they were actually basically built out a 2-car fleet that allowed them to go from not knowing anything about that to within basically 9 months having what would be the kind of, what would be the underlying revenue boost for the drivers, validated, what would be the depreciation on the vehicle. These are going to be very highly used vehicles. Does that kind of depreciate things? Is there, in fact, extra demand for these kinds of services? What happens in terms of kind of the driver experience? How often do they how do drivers kind of want to interact with a company that's leasing them a vehicle that gives them a premium price? And they were actually able to turn that from just a discussion into hard numbers. And actually, upon graduation, they were actually able, these, some went off to PhD programs, some went off to autonomous vehicle companies, right? They were actually able to sell that company and actually, for the main founder, recoup most of the cost of his underlying MBA. Okay, that kind of experience, right? Where a venture is able to go from just being an idea to being a series of validated hypotheses or not, gives some broad principles for entrepreneurial experimentation. Take a peek before walking through a one-way door, right? So in other words, really prioritize, and this goes back to Michael, I think it was Michael Ward's comment, right? So often startups don't think about opportunity cost. And one thing we try to do is give a kind of rigorous framework and a practical approach that lets a founder actually kind of prioritize their experiments. Test small to choose big. Something can't be true in general unless it's true somewhere in particular. The Taxi team were able to figure out kind of what was true right with a 2-vehicle fleet. They were able to figure out the basic economics of what it would mean to kind of work in that domain at relatively low cost. And they understood that they would be able to achieve economies of scale if they then went and bought 100 or 500 vehicles and became a major player in the industry. And then they could kind of think about what that would mean for those economics. But the kind of basic learning that they had to do of understanding what premium they could get and what would be the underlying business model, they were able to surface through iterative experimentation during their time. They learned enough to know what they're uncertain about, so they were able to quickly divide into things that they were going to be able to learn very quickly and things they wouldn't really able to learn about until they had scaled. For example, how quickly would it be before big rental car companies, Avis and Hertz, got in the game? Well, that's a variable that you can get a little bit of competitive intelligence, but interestingly, That's not under their control. So that has to be something that kind of they're uncertain about. And how much you choose to learn depends on what you choose to test. Okay. What we do is we bring that kind of high focus on validating hypotheses about our most critical choices to each of the most critical choice domains facing a startup. Choosing your customer, choosing your technology and innovation, choosing how you organize and your team, and choosing how you compete, and kind of with whom and how to compete, and how you can get your idea into the marketplace. So what I want to do is I want to hand it over to my great colleague, Erin Scott, who's going to take you along from here, kind of dig a little bit more deeply into those choices and how they fit together as an overall entrepreneurial strategy.
Great, thank you, Scott. All right, so what we wanted to do is show you a little bit about what this looks like in these dimensions of choice before we bring it together into these different strategies. And we're going to start with the choice of customer. The choice of customer is often the most salient choice that entrepreneurs make. And many entrepreneurs are very familiar that the beachhead, that choice of that initial market that you're going to go after, is incredibly powerful and useful. And in particular, that an ideal beachhead is really something that allows you to ride that market S-curve into the mainstream market. And there's a number of incredibly useful tools, including our colleagues Bill Olet, who has a great course also at ExecEd, really thinking about those steps that you need to make as you go from that beachhead to the mainstream market. What we want you to think about today is also this element of choice that plays into that. And to do so, we want to look at another great startup, an innovative startup founded, I think about a decade ago now, 23andMe, really founded on really leveraging the innovations that were coming out of the Human Genome Project to enable patients to really take a lot of information to their engagement in their own health and really manage that. And they were thinking about the many different beachheads that they could choose as moving it forward. Where would they start within this? And so they saw kind of two different options that really quickly were both viable and of interest to them. And so as much as we just did, if you guys want to drop in the chat, which beachhead would you really recommend for them? One was to really focus on consumer-focused ancestry research, including unknown relatives and surprising traits. So, learn if you can spell your P, for instance, after you eat asparagus. Another was to work with physicians and the FDA to enhance prenatal genetic screening, which I think parents in the room know is incredibly valuable within this. So we'll just start to see, which would you recommend is the ideal starting point for a research-constrained startup leveraging this emerging technology? I'll just give it a second here. Absolutely, I love that people are suggesting, and we can do some experimentation and learning within this. But what's interesting is much like we saw with the other, right? You can take a reasonable set of people that are well-informed, and you will see this tension in this debate about these alternative paths. Both are viable options. What they saw very quickly, though, is these choices of initial market, of initial beachhead, had some ramifications on the mainstream market that they would build. It would include, not only what that first product would be, but the team that you would hire and those follow-on products that you would release, and how different stakeholders viewed the value you created and in the ecosystem itself. And so really, we want you guys to think about is that this choice of beachhead is not just the one that really allows you to move to the mainstream market, but is it in fact a choice of which mainstream market you're going to go after because within that. And so that allows us to really be even more strategic in thinking about this early choice of customers. We absolutely want a customer that we create value for. Otherwise, they won't buy. They won't be a customer. But there's also in really thinking about, and we have a playbook to kind of go through this, and we go through it in the course, is thinking about how you can pick that mainstream, that beachhead customer to really optimize your learning and experimentation within that, as well as your ability to build and make it to the mainstream market and then that evolution of your company itself. And so really it's this process of, as Scott nicely walked through, of really being concrete about what can you test really early on to help you understand both what are options that are non-viable, but also really understanding the different trade-offs and the different choices that will be important among different viable options so that you can choose one and ultimately leave behind others, at least temporarily, to be really focused in moving forward. And so we see this in the choice of customer, but we also see these in these other core dimensions of choice as well. And so this choice of technology, this choice of innovation and how your company will leverage that is also where you need to be really concrete and really surfacing what are your different options, but then focus ultimately so you can really make that a success. And so Mariana and Nusha founded BioBot Analytics, an incredible company here out of MIT. And what their hypothesis on how they created value is there's an incredible amount of information in our sewers. In fact, there was hundreds of things that they could measure and they could catalog. And so really an early choice for them was, what are we going to measure? How are we going to make that accessible? Who are we going to make that accessible to? Individuals, community, and governments. How are we going to really interface within those? And ultimately, they decided very much to focus. And those choices that they made about how they were going to develop that technology turned out to be really instrumental in the pandemic in really monitoring the different levels of community spread of COVID-19. And so we want us to really think about those choice of technologies so that you can be incredibly focused, so you give your idea and your innovation the best chance of success, especially important in these times where many ventures are more resource constrained than in the past, perhaps. Another core choice is your choice of organization. You can think of this as not only kind of your choice of co-founder, but also your choice of which capabilities and resources you're going to build and which you're going to access in the market more broadly. And so, for Gimlet, which is really, I think, one of the many that have revolutionized, the podcast industry, and particularly the long form of that, Alex, was very thoughtful in thinking about what capabilities he wanted to bring in as a co-founder, and really looking for that and having honest conversations with Matt Lieber, who he would go on to recruit, as well as them both thinking about kind of those really how they would build out that organization that allowed it to be this leader in this space, and ultimately their acquisition by Spotify within that. And then this last choice is this choice of competition, where Scott and I often get folks say, wait a second, you get to choose your competition. Well, you don't get to choose whether you have competition, or I guess there's one way not to have competition, which is to have something no one wants to buy. But good ideas involve competition. And so thinking about how you can really choose with whom you compete and the nature of that competition, how you're going to compete with them, is something, a choice that entrepreneurs in fact have. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this before we kind of bring it together into this entrepreneurial strategy compass. And that is that for a good idea, you can really consider this choice of with whom and how you're going to compete. Are you going to orient more towards collaborating or more towards direct competition with the established players? Are you going to invest in control or are you going to invest in execution? And so your idea is really center stage here. And for most ideas, you're able to really think along this full compass, this full scale. And so let's look at that a little bit more. Another great MIT startup is PillPack. And PillPack really had this wonderful design innovation that made it easier for folks to take their prescriptions. And one playbook, in fact, the playbook advocated by many individuals, was that they should focus on licensing this to CVS and established pharmacies. Like, that is a well-worn path that brings success. But they ultimately decided, in fact, to compete and to build their own pharmacy. And those are very different sets of choices, not only on the top level, but also on the other complementary choices that you would need to make. And so being very concrete can be very illuminating. On the other dimension of this is this control versus execution. This saying, early on, are we going to really focus on controlling our ideas through secrecy, through patent protection and other avenues of protection? Or are we going to kind of get out there and really focus first and foremost on learning and execution and rapid iteration with our customers and with other stakeholders? And so Payal, when she was founding ClassPass, actually really focused on this method of execution and learning that continued kind of getting ahead and staying ahead and continuing to iterate and learn from her customers so that she could really build out something that, despite having, the ability for others to enter and compete, few were able to do. And she was able to build a billion-dollar company that continues to create value for gym goers, but also gyms around the world. And so these two axes of collaborate, compete, and execution for control, they come together as our organizing principle around thinking about strategy for startups. And with these, our other choices really take center stage, and we see these 4 bundles of choices, these 4 strategy for startups. And what's really important here is that your idea is center stage. And so your idea is not necessarily confined to one strategy, but as Scott has mentioned, for most ideas, you're able to really consider multiple routes to commercialization. And so just wanted to really introduce these different strategies for startups today. And so the first strategy is this intellectual property strategy. This is the ideas factory, this innovation and continuing innovation process. Think of Dolby here. And here you're going to invest in control and orient through collaboration. So you want to really gain control through those patents, trademarks, et cetera, of these novel innovations, and then use those control rights to really facilitate trade in the market for ideas and to reduce commercialization costs and competitive pressure. So often you're not actually making the final product, you're collaborating with others to do. In fact, this was the playbook of Dolby, was quite successful in that process. The next strategy, very popular strategy, is the disruption strategy, the hustlers or the creative destruction strategy. And this strategy is, really where you're orienting towards competition, but you're investing heavily in execution. And so that initial customer group that you want to work with is for actually customer segments that are currently underserved or poorly served by those existing firms' offerings. So very different from partnering with an established firm. And you want to use this process of iteration and learning to really get ahead and stay ahead, stay close to your customer and then slowly expand using those learnings to mainstream customer segments. And this is a playbook that we've seen quite successful with Rent the Runway, as well as Salesforce. And then the next strategy, and this is my favorite strategy because I think it's the unsung hero of strategies for startups, is the value stream strategy. And so here you're really focusing on this core competency. You're this partner with your in this value chain itself. And so you're going to orient towards collaboration and invest heavily in execution within this. And so instead of a disruption strategy where you're investing in execution, but you're going to you're competing against the established player, here you want to work to be their preferred partner, right? You want to bring to market the best solution for this slice of the value chain and really find partners that have a reputation for treating startups fairly and well, and then continue through execution to own that slice of the value chain. And this is something that we've seen, Infosys from their founding, and then, now many decades later, continue to really own and build out and maintain competitive advantage in that slice of their value chain. And then last, but certainly not least, is the architectural strategy. This is kind of the builders or the 0 to 1. And here you're going to focus on orienting towards competition and invest in control. This is the most ambitious of strategies for startups. And what you're doing here is you're architecting an entirely new value chain by coordinating with multiple stakeholders to provide compelling new value for consumers within this. And as you're architecting that new strategy, you want to really control a key resource or interface that will have enduring value for those multiple stakeholders itself. And so this is something that we certainly see with OpenTable that has continued to really create value, but also capture value by working with restaurants and us as consumers when we need reservations to create value for both parties itself. And so as you've probably seen as we go through this, is you're starting to get a sense of not only are these different orientations with respect to competition, but that they implicitly involve different choices around which customer you're going to serve, how you're going to serve them, how you're going to innovate, but also the organization that you're going to need to build. And so this is where the strategy compass is really useful to think about those alternative routes to commercialization. And in particular, especially these days, more than ever, you need to be incredibly focused about what are the choices that we're going to have, not only outward facing, but externally within that, and be very concrete as you move forward within this. And so, we see this, I think most sharply, and when we think about these different strategies, really explicitly on what those choices are, right? This value chain, for instance, very much about this partnership model with those collaborators, where a disruption model is very, very different early on, focusing on entirely different customers within that moving forward. And so it's by this early process of experimentation that we're able to surface multiple alternatives within this. We want to use that process of experimentation and learning to leave behind, certainly alternative routes that are not viable, but ultimately making a choice as to which one to focus on, at least temporarily, and then move forward. And so Scott's going to walk you through a startup that's done that.
Yep. So thank you so much, Erin. We could, once again, we really would love to work with, anyone on the webinar here. We're going to offer this 2-day course. We have lots of materials in these areas. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor, I know there's a lot here. Just kind of break it really concrete. Let me just kind of give you a very concrete example of a company that both Erin and I have worked with quite closely since founding, called RapidSOS. Here are the founders, Michael Martin and Nick Koralik. Michael was actually an HBS student. Everyone can make a mistake. No, that's not true. We love HBS. But Nick Koralik was a student here at MIT. And they developed they kind of focused on the need for mobile-first emergency response. So this is about 6-7 years ago. They were thinking about, right? That was a time when if you kind of called on your mobile phone, 911 for emergency response, you might be, the emergency response wouldn't know where you were and wouldn't be able to access any of the functionality of your smartphone, of your mobile phone. They figured out a way to break through that technologically. They knew there was a lot of new technology they could bring to bear on that problem. They weren't the first people to recognize this problem, but they had a kind of concrete advance that said they kind of identified a potential solution to a problem that had previously evaded. And then the question is kind of, right, what should they do? And so we started to work with them. And so here was a kind of little, there's actually down in there, this was the entire company in their office down in New York at that time, kind of, as you can see, very similar kind of piece. We were working with them at the time, and their team kind of surfaced a bunch of alternative strategies for 911, just to kind of give you some examples, right? So on the one hand, maybe they should work with the big players in the industry, such as Motorola, right? Motorola has a dominant, even though Motorola is a cell phone company, kind of not as big, but right, Motorola has still a dominant player in that emergency response space. They went around to some Silicon Valley venture capitalists, and they're like, oh, this is Uber for ambulances. You should essentially replace the existing government-provided emergency response. Some insurance companies came to them, very much that value chain strategy, and said, we would love to see kind of people use this within our app. That could actually be cost saving to us because it kind of enhances emergency response, which is cost, kind of enhances our cost effectiveness. And actually it'd be a kind of value-added feature of, the apps, right? The kind of insurance company app. And finally, they started to talk to domestic violence agencies, nonprofits, the American Heart Association, American Epilepsy Association, who sort of had kind of essentially a burning platform type customers. And they were actually able to use this process to kind of actually say, actually some of those options are really good down the line, but aren't good for us right now. Or if we start working with insurance companies right now who are willing to put money on the table so we can keep the business afloat and not lose a lot of equity, well, that's actually going to divert us from really kind of solving this at scale for the entire industry. And so they were able to use that process over time to really settle. In this particular case, they focused first on that disruption strategy, focusing on those burning platform customers. That became a stepping stone to begin to grow and scale the company. There's a technology that they are is on every cell phone that you might have. Both they are the lead of kind of technology, both within emergency response for the iPhone, as well as with Android. Just to give you a sort of sense of the impact that you see, right? They had this idea. Does it actually have the impact they want? And so let me just kind of play a little short video courtesy of Apple. Oh.
911, what's your emergency? I've been in the car accident. My car slipped. There's water getting in the car and I can't get out. 911, what is your emergency? I came on paddleboarding and a hard wind pitching me off the street. Okay, do not hang up. 911, what's your emergency? I'm here at the farm. I broke my leg. Straight down 21 feet. I sure need help quick. Are you by yourself? Yes. Have you tried to get out? Have you tried to bust the window or something? I'm pretty far on. In the ocean? I can't get to my cell phone. I'm talking on my Apple Watch. Try to keep talking to me. Okay. Can't quite the wind anymore. It's getting deeper. Can you come in next? Please hurry. I'm hurting real bad. You're going to seek help, okay? I see them. Open the door. Hold on. We just put the jacket seat. Okay, but your head's above water? Yes, sir.
So all those are real stories, right? Drawn very carefully by Apple, but really at scale. What they were able to do was move that idea from just being an idea that maybe existed in a research lab or was talked about in a government report. But Michael and Nick and their team were able to make those core choices, just as Erin talked about, organize them as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy, and use that as the basis of scaling an impactful venture. I'm going to hand it back to Erin to kind of do one more little deep dive on how we kind of think about this, and then we'll open up to the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Scott. And so just as we wrap up, I want to tell a little bit about the course, which is much the same process actually that we worked with Nick and Michael, which is to really focus on really understanding these core choices that are facing startup innovators. Really think about both that experimentation and learning, as well as that implementation process of these different strategies, and then ultimately to scale them so that you can move forward and really creating that impact that you want in the world with your idea. The folks that join are folks that have an idea that they are working on at all stages of entrepreneurship, and those corporate entrepreneurs, investors, and other stakeholders really wanting to understand this process. The first day we go through those core dimensions of choice, customer, organization, tech, and competition. And then day 2, we start to put these together with real live cases written on these entrepreneurs, such as the ones we've highlighted today, where we're really capturing those key moments of choice themselves, and really how those choices really among those different strategies reflect their ecosystem, but as others have mentioned in chat, also their perspective on the impact that they want to create, and their personality, as I saw someone in the chat mention as well, really thinking through those, because entrepreneurship is ultimately very a personal process. And so just as we wrap up, the power of entrepreneurship is incredibly powerful, I think, as Rob started us with. And it's not only to really start and identify these opportunities, but it's really to move those into the world. And that requires making active choice to really create value, but also capture that value. And the more exciting the innovation, the more important, in fact, it is for strategy, for your ability to really commercialize that and build out that new company with competitive advantage. And ultimately, that process of choosing an entrepreneurial strategy really forces you to come to terms with the core value that you'll create, and especially in these times, to be very disciplined in how you'll focus to capture that value on a sustainable basis. So thank you guys so much. We've enjoyed seeing the chat so active, and hopefully we have some time to take a few questions as well.
Erin and Scott, thank you so much. It's amazing how you were able to condense your material from your program into this short webinar and still provide enough, I think, key details and information clearly from the chat, the stream in the chat. It's been useful for a lot of our viewers today to learn more about your frameworks and your research. So thank you for doing that. And to those of you that have joined for the chat, I've noticed several requests for this, a recording of this. We will make a recording available. In fact, we have a whole library of this webinar and similar webinars on our ExecEd website. You'll have access to this webinar and many more through our website as well. We do have a lot of questions. There has been great engagement. I think the first one I'd start with, and this is open to either of you, how to avoid test to choose to as you're looking at this approach.
So thank you so much, Rob, and thank you, Erin, for everything. So part of what, one of the kind of key insights I think that we had working with startups, both in our research, but also just working with companies, working with founders, is exactly they needed a framework that they were poorly served by existing tools that did not focus them on the importance of actual choice. And so this choice-based approach, what it does is it kind of identifies the condition under which it's time to move forward down one path and leave those other paths behind, at least temporarily, and gives a kind of methodology for doing so. What does it mean to actually go down a path? Means to actually undertake learning and experimentation that involves more commitment than that commitment-free learning where all you were doing was surfacing possibilities. And as I think Erin already kind of hinted at in the Gimlet case, what we would tend to see is that those almost, right, your first customers and your first employees, the first people who you start to bring on board, all of a sudden they shape the path that you walk down. And making that a choice rather than something that happens to you and all of a sudden you realize you're in a different place than you intended is very key to what we think allows for success. And even more important, I think, keeps entrepreneurs in sort of full control of the choices they make and the impact they're likely to have. I'm not sure if you want to add on to that, Erin.
Absolutely. I think, one dimension that's incredibly important here, and I've seen it in working with startups around strategy, is oftentimes we, particularly when we're co-founders, we think we're implicitly building to the same North Star, and being very concrete about which strategy we're going after actually helps prevent that test to choose to, because you can start to really surface those conversations about really concretely what do we want to build, and what are we leaving behind. And so often I've seen that some of the tensions and sometimes where the startup was making choices that weren't coherent actually reflected two different visions of the company, two different strategies. And once those founders were able to have that concrete discussion, the company, not only just the founders, but also the team and the other stakeholders were able to more concretely build and more successfully build to that future.
Great, thank you both. And just we're approaching the top of the hour. I do want to just call attention to the slide that's presented right now. The next running of this program will be on March 23rd and March 24th. As you see, the format for this delivery will be live online, which we've become very adept at running these programs live online and making them very interactive with breakout groups and polling and functionality like that. One thing that we've discovered over the past few years is by offering these programs live online, it enables people to attend more openly from around the world. They don't have to travel to Cambridge, and they can log in from their own desks or home and participate fully in the program. But we do anticipate that we'll be running additional dates in 2023. Actually, I see this is 2022. In 2023, we'll be running this first program live online and expect to add other programs that will run here on the MIT campus as well. So whether you're joining us here on campus or online, we certainly hope to see you and would welcome you to join us in one of our MIT classrooms. I guess with just probably about time enough for one final question, Erin and Scott, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of the tipping point for strategy for startups. Is there a point? I think of so often how we have startups here in the Kendall Square area that are at local accelerators or incubators, and they outgrow their their startup space and then kind of move into more established office space or physical presence. Is there an equivalent for strategy for startups? Do you get to a point in an organization where you need to take a different approach to strategy? And if so, what point is that?
So really, I know we're at the top of the hour, and thank you, Rob. So one point I would make is that, we've worked with lots of former students, companies that find some of these tools valuable for corporate entrepreneurship, for new initiatives, for even just kind of surfacing new alternatives within existing business. But one of the things that I would say, the compass and the kind of core tools provide is they let you kind of get to the point where you have the resources and capabilities, you have the reputation and commitments that allow some of those more traditional strategic management tools, right? Kind of, very traditional tools that do involve very often kind of, should I go global? How should I think about expanding to an adjacent market? What does it mean to kind of build out, a multi-site workforce, whatever that might be? All of those core tools of strategic management at some point come into play. To me, that crystallization comes from strategy for startups is fundamentally about choosing the path and undertaking the initial rounds of scaling. Once you've scaled a viable business, now is the time that then some of those other tools can also be brought on board. I'm not sure if you wanted to add onto that, Erin.
I agree. And I see this a bit in the chat about evolving strategies.
Yeah.
And so we go into this in the course much more detail, but is thinking about how you lay up that initial entrepreneurial strategy, sometimes into what we call more of a success pivot, into another entrepreneurial strategy, and then moving into competitive strategy. And it's really thinking about an entrepreneurial strategy, a strategy for startups, is really laying that foundation on which you're going to build that competitive advantage and that broader impact as your organization and your venture grows.
Excellent. And I see that we've just reached the top of the hour. So Erin, Scott, thank you again. Thank you to all my colleagues here in the marketing team at MIT Sloan Executive Education that helped organize and run this event today. Thank you to all of you that have connected from around the world to join us for the past hour. I hope that you found that the content and information both useful and relevant to the work that you're doing as entrepreneurs, innovators, and anybody that's in this wonderful startup ecosystem throughout the world. Please stay tuned for additional webinars that we'll be running. We like to do these regularly. I encourage you to visit our executive education website. As you see, we've got our next webinar coming up on November 29th at 10 in the morning Eastern time on managing in the hybrid workplace. We'll hope to see you right back here. And again, would love to see you in one of our MIT classrooms soon. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.